Hey, welcome to The Conversation. My name is Kyle, and I'm coming to you from the First Colony Church of Christ in Sugar Land, Texas. I'm so glad that you're here, and I am glad that we are together. Hey, right as we start, you can do a couple of things, all right? Number one, you can log on to our chat if you want and say hi. Our moderators are right there. They're waiting on you. So if you've got some questions about the First Colony Church or you've got some questions about the conversation, you can go ahead and ask those right there. But when you do that, go ahead and introduce yourself first. Tell us your name. Tell us where you're watching from. That's pretty cool. Number two, this is kind of a new idea, but I think it's kind of cool. Invite someone to join you right now in the conversation. You can create your own watch party. Create your own watch party. Go ahead and invite someone right now. Send someone a text. Post it on your socials. Call it a watch party today. And what you can do with that is that when the conversation is over here in about 30 minutes, you can spend some time talking with each other about what we've discussed here on the conversation. And by doing that, you can continue the conversation. So go ahead and send this in as a text message. Post it on your Facebook account, post it on your Twitter account or your IG account. I think it'll be cool, and I think it'll be a good way to extend the goodness of the gospel and the goodness of the grace of Jesus that we're going to talk about today with other people, those that might need to hear the incredible news of Jesus Christ. So do that today, will you? I would appreciate that. I think that would be some good stuff. Today, here at the First Colony Church is Super Sunday. It's Bring a Friend Day. If you participated and experienced our first service worship, that's super. I am so glad that you did that. I'm glad that you were available to do that. If you've not, you can still catch our second service, and you can do that. You can go ahead and send people the invite to that as well. If you've caught our second service, since we're coming to you twice on a Sunday, go ahead and take the rebroadcast and share that. Our guest speaker today at the First Colony Church is astronaut Barry Wilmore. Super cool guy. Great conversation with Ronnie today. I think you'll be blessed if you've not seen it, and I think that conversation will be a blessing to someone else. So invite someone to watch with you. If you watched first, invite them to watch with you again on second. If you've watched second, invite someone to watch the rebroadcast. There's all kinds of ways and opportunities to keep the conversation going. So go ahead and do that. Let's jump right in. Today's session on the conversation is the second session in our teaching series called Magnetic. We are looking at the magnetic nature of God as found in Psalm 23. And to do that, we're going to take some journeys throughout the Bible. And today, especially, we're going to jump to the Gospel of Mark. Last week, we jumped to the Gospel of John. Today, we're going to jump to the Gospel of Mark in expanding and surgically dissecting Psalm 23 to give it some real-time application for us. I think you're gonna like this. So let's begin. All right, let's begin by quoting Psalm 23. Now, I'm going to throw you a curveball. I said this last week in the conversation. I'm going to say it again. I memorized Psalm 23 when I was a kid in the King James English. That's the only Bible. The only version I had was the King James Version. So I'm going to quote it with all of the greatness of the English of King James. All right, so here we go. And if it's a little different than yours, that's okay. But you might think it's kind of cool. So here we go. Psalm 23 in the King James English. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh, there's the first one, he maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside quiet waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art, got to get that T, thou art with me. Thy, when's the last time you said that? Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest, there's a big one, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Hey, if you memorized Psalm 23 in the King James English, go ahead and tell us about that in the chat, or leave us a like if you're on YouTube. That's the way I learned it. And even today, I said this last week, but when I say it today, when I pray it, because I pray Psalm 23 quite often, I pray it in the King James English. It's just the kind of the way it comes from my head through my mouth. It's just the way it is, and I don't really know it any other way. In fact, when people read it in public settings and they don't read it in the King James English, I kind of feel like I've been cheated a little bit. That's not true. That's how I feel, because that's the only way I've ever memorized it. Last week we talked about verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Well, today we're going to talk about verse 2. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me, or he makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside quiet waters. Verse 2 is really kind of catchy when you hear it on its own, right? I'm just kidding. There's really not a whole lot there. He leads me. He makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside quiet waters. You know, those of us who live in the cities, we don't live outside, we don't live out in the country, we don't really understand what that really means, right? What it means to be made to lie down in green pastures. And we don't really understand what it means to be made to be led by quiet waters. If you live in the city, you probably have a very small piece of real estate. You might have a nice house, but it's on a small lot. The grass outside is a nuisance. You don't want to cut it. You might even pay somebody to do it. You might not even know what quiet waters are. When's the last time you've been to a nice pond or a lake or something that is isolated and alone with just you and the sound and the coolness of the water? That really doesn't happen a lot for those of us who live in the cities. Now, I'm going to pause right here because we're going to use verse 2 as a springboard to something that I think is pretty special in the New Testament. But I got to pause right here, and I got to tell you why we're doing this, all right? So to do that, we have to talk about some of the things that Paul wrote in his Corinthian letters. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, Paul made a pretty telling statement about his purpose and his aim in being with people and talking with people and sharing the gospel with people. He said this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23. He says that while we were with you, we preach in the present tense is what he writes. We preach Christ crucified. So in chapter 2, he says in the past tense, because he's writing after having been in Corinth for a while, he says something about this very statement in the past tense. But in chapter 1, verse 23, he speaks in the present tense. This is his purpose. He preaches Christ crucified. I want you to kind of understand that. Now, I know we're going to be in Psalm 23, verse 2, and then we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark, but I need to start here because this was the entire motivation for Paul was to preach Christ crucified. Now, what he does after that statement is that he makes an addendum to that statement that is really a little frightening. So he says that we preach Christ crucified, and he says that is a stumbling block to Jewish people, and it's foolishness to Gentile people. Now, when you kind of read that statement on its own, you are left scratching your head a little bit, right? Why would Paul preach the good news of Jesus, the Christ crucified? Why is that message a stumbling block to Jewish people and foolishness to Gentiles? Why does he preach that if that doesn't affect the felt needs of the people, of his audience? Now, that's an interesting statement, right? So he preaches a message that does not really tickle the fancies of the people that are listening. Later on in chapter 2, just a chapter later, he says that when I was with you in Corinth, all I really wanted to know was Christ and him crucified. Now, you have to think about Paul's experience in Corinth. He's there in Corinth. In fact, he's making his own living. He is working, as most people in Rome did, in an occupation that required manual labor. It was labor intensive. He worked all the time. In fact, later on in the book itself, it says that he actually financially supported him and a few other guys while he was training them as his disciples to share the gospel. So in all of these interactions in the marketplace, in customer service, in difficult work environments, every iota of every moment, Paul sought to see and to know Jesus and him crucified in every one of those situations. That was the impetus for who he was, right? He preached a Christ crucified, that the anointed one of God, the one who was anointed to save the planet from its very sinful nature and from its own sin, was willingly subjected to a murderous mob that killed him so that he could be resurrected. That is the single message of the gospel, and that is the single message that Paul presented. Now, how that applied to people, it comes out in various ways, especially in 1 Corinthians. Paul uses that message as he talks about all kinds of things. He talks about the community of the church in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the identity, the holiness of marriage, the sacredness of heterosexual marriage, by the way. He talks about propriety in worship services, how people are to act in gatherings where they worship Jesus. So he talks about that at the end of the book of 1 Corinthians in the idea of resurrection. So this idea of Christ, the anointed one of God, being crucified, that God himself becomes a human, becomes the anointed one among the entire human race to bear the sin of the world and to be crucified for that sin, to be himself the substitutionary offering, receiving the wrath of God for our own sins. That crucifixion was the message of Paul, and it is the message of the gospel, and it's the message that framed everything. How that presents itself in your specific circumstance in mind has a variety of applications. And I know that we've spent some time in the conversation talking about life application and how the message of the gospel absolutely does some specific things in our lives. But for the conversation today and through the next few weeks as we talk about Psalm 23, you might be left wanting some of this life application. But I say that to only say that if that's what you're here for, then you might not find it. But what you will find is Christ and him crucified. It was Paul's basic belief, and it's mine, that if you see Christ crucified, if you see that, if you fall in love and follow a Christ that's been crucified, your actions in life, every decision, every conversation will change because it will mimic that of Jesus himself. The truth, living the truth, saying the truth is so much easier than willfully committing in some sort of deception, in some sort of sin. And I think that's where we're going to find ourselves today. So, Psalm chapter 23, verse 2, he makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside quiet waters. What's kind of cool about this verse, really about the entirety of this chapter, we'll hit on some of these things, but I want to show you a couple of ways, or really one specific way. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, so if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. In Mark chapter 6, how Jesus assumes again the identity of the shepherd. We talked about this last week as the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. Jesus assumes the identity of the shepherd in John chapter 10. Well, he does it again today in Mark chapter 6 in a pretty famous story. So let's read this together. This is Mark chapter 10, and we will begin in verse 30. It's a rather long passage of scripture, but I think you'll You'll find it easy to follow along. The apostles gathered around Jesus in Mark chapter 6, verse 30, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. Verse 31. Then because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to his apostles, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." You've probably already seen some of the similar language. That's intentional. Verse 32. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. They got to this solitary place. We'll talk about that solitary place in just a minute. Verse 34, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. And we're going to pause there. We're going to pick up there in just a minute in verse 35. But I think it's important to kind of know where we are and what's going on here and what in the world this has to do with Psalm 23, especially in verse 2. This story follows a flashback in the Gospel of Mark that concerns itself with John the Baptist. The previous story is a flashback scene of the death of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod. It's a story in the beginning of Mark, or previously in Mark chapter 6, of a banquet, a feast, where what's presented, and it's true, it's there and you can read it, is John's head on a platter. So immediately following the story, we come back to the present narrative of Mark, where Jesus and his apostles are in a boat and they're getting out of the boat. They're now at Capernaum. And they're going to get out of the boat, but they're all exhausted, right? They're tired. It's been a tiring experience following Jesus. So Jesus, what does he do? He commands them, he makes them get some rest. In fact, the way that it's written in verse 31, the NIV softens it a little bit. Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Well, yeah, it's a little more forceful than that. Jesus is commanding them. He's making them get some rest. Right? So, Psalm 23, right? Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me. He makes me. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. One of the great things about Psalm 23 is it's so much more than a domesticated poem. You and I, we tend to domesticate this poem. We want to make it really soft and fluffy and wonderful and ooey gooey, right? There's more to Psalm 23 than that. It presents God as a shepherd king. Not just as a shepherd, but shepherd is a title for king. We talked about that in our previous conversation. Who controls the actions of humanity. And in Psalm chapter 23, verse 2, he does that. He makes us lie down in green pastures, and he leads us beside quiet waters. There's a forcefulness to God's experience with us as his shepherd king in our lives. It is something that we don't necessarily want to talk about, right? Because it leads into all sorts of conversations that we're not going to have here about who's really in charge of our lives. Is it God? Is it us, right? Well, what we know from Psalm 23 is that somehow in the absolute details that might not be known to us, God does have some and does exert some control over our lives. That's pretty profound. We see that here where Jesus assumes this title of shepherd, but he doesn't really use that title, but he certainly has the very actions of a shepherd in this story. He makes his apostles come and get some rest. Now, it's also important to note in verse 32 that they pick for themselves what the NIV calls a solitary place, right? It's actually the same word in verse 31 and verse 32. In verse 31 in the NIV, Jesus says, come by yourselves to a quiet place. In verse 32, the NIV says that they find themselves in a solitary place. The quiet place and the solitary place, same word. And it is the word that's translated in other parts of this gospel, especially in chapter 1, as wilderness. It's also translated as desert. But here, I think to our detriment, the NIV pulls that language out and makes it a little different. It's a quiet place. It's a solitary place. I think Mark wanted it to sound more like this concept of a wilderness or a desert, the very concept he's already used in this gospel. It's a concept of a wasteland. It's a concept of a place of questioning and a place of wondering. And sometimes, especially in the Gospel of Mark, it's a place of danger. It's a place where there are battles to be waged. It assumes the identity of the wilderness wandering of the Hebrews after they were rescued from slavery in Egypt. They wandered, though, in the wilderness, in the desert, for 40 years before they were given the promised land. Well, here it's the same language, and Mark is using that language here, that they are going to find some peace and quiet in this wasteland. Heretofore, though, in the Gospel of Mark, it's a place of loneliness. But now we find that even this wasteland, this wilderness, this desert is full of people. It's got a crowd. Jesus' popularity and his magnetism is drawing people into these sacred spaces. Let's keep going in verse 35. I'm sorry. Let's start in verse 34. So when Jesus landed and he saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, Jesus doesn't assume the identity of this. This is just the analogy, right? In John 10, he says, I am the good shepherd. He's not saying that here. So he began to teach them many things. Verse 35, by this time it was late in the day, and you probably know how this story ends, and his disciples came to him, Jesus' disciples, and they said to him, this is a remote place. It's a wilderness. It's a desert. There's nothing here. They said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But Jesus answered, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, that would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? So Jesus asked, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5. And I like this. And we have 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all of the people, oh, listen to this, to have all of the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate, and they were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. And the number of the men who had eaten was about 5,000. It's an impressive story, right? Kind of a plot twist there. He's teaching them. His heart breaks for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So what does he do first? He teaches them. And then from there, because the time gets long, all of these people, at least 5,000 men, probably more, come away eating perhaps the largest meal they had ever eaten in their lives. Now, for you and I, we're in a rather cushy place, especially if you're watching from the Western world. We don't have to worry about meals not satisfying our hunger and our appetite. But in Palestine, in this city, in Capernaum, in the time of Jesus, someone eating until they were full was a rare occasion for the common person. This is a pretty cool eyewitness detail in this story, that not only did they eat, but they were eat until they were satisfied. Now, you caught a couple of these things, right? Jesus makes them lie down in the green grass, right? In Psalm 23, verse 2, he makes us lie down in green pastures. that hook, that semblance for this conversation is so important and integral to the entirety of who Jesus becomes in his life in the Gospels. He is the shepherd of Psalm 23. And before we domesticate this and take this even farther and say, Jesus meets all our needs and he makes sure that we never go hungry and that we have everything we could ever need. Well, you and I both know that's not necessarily always true. You and I have people in our lives who are fraught with illness and sickness and they don't recover. And so it's almost a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, if God is the shepherd, and he is the shepherd as seen in the life of Jesus, so if Jesus is the shepherd of me, and I don't lack in verse 1, then how can I gel that with an obvious lack in my life of things that are so terribly important to me that I lose? Well, this is when we have to kind of see what's going on in Mark chapter 6, right? Because we also want to domesticate Mark chapter 6 a little bit. We want to say, Jesus, he feeds these people, you'll never go hungry. Or he gives the bread of life, right? We love these little phrases, these little church sign phrases that look kind of nifty, but sometimes they don't really mean much. It's kind of what that sounds like. It's important to know something of what's going on here in Mark chapter 6. And we got some clues. So as we round out the conversation, I want to share some of this with you and how Jesus assumes the title of shepherd, not only in the gospel, but in our lives. His first reaction to the sheep without a shepherd is to teach them. And he has to teach them some pretty important things. I think we can read into some things here when we read between the lines, that especially when we read that there were 5,000 men, Jesus was incredibly popular, and he was popular among a group of people that were at the bottom of society. Mark calls these people the crowd. You can find it in Mark chapter 2. They have no social safety net. They have no one to lead them. And so often they find in Jesus this would-be rebel leader. So you get a sense here that Jesus is teaching them why that might not be possible, why he is not their military leader to overthrow the powers that be. Because they are shepherdless. They don't have anyone to defend them. So Jesus probably teaches them that. And this teaching is so intense that at the end of the day, Jesus orders his disciples to feed them from the food that they have. And he orders them in a large rectangle of people. He groups them and he makes them sit on the green grass. It's actually more than that. When they sat down to eat, people actually reclined to eat. That's how you ate. So they're lying in green pasture here. So in his actions, he is exhibiting himself as the good shepherd, as the shepherd of Psalm 23. And probably what's even more important here is that in verse 41, it says that then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. That little phrase here kind of disguises what's happening in the Greek language, is that the miracle didn't necessarily happen from the amount of food that the disciples had, but they kept coming to Jesus for the distribution. And so he kept giving them the food to pass out. It wasn't just multiplying necessarily in their baskets, in their reserves. Jesus was the one that continued to give them what they needed. And so that's pretty important in this story, that it was from Jesus where all of these resources came. And so we find something integral here about the good shepherd, the Lord as the shepherd of Psalm 23. We find this here. What we find is this. All right, remember, we've got to resist the temptation to domesticate these stories. There's something more powerful happening here. What's happening here is that Jesus is assuming in the lives of these people at the bottom of society the one who provides, the one who shows them that he is the answer to their sin. They had been taught and confused that they were not part of the religious society of Judaism because they weren't able to worship at the temple. They did not have the resources to offer the proper tithes and the proper sacrifices. They were poor. They didn't have enough food to eat. So the Jewish elite saw these people as the bottom. And Jesus said, you know what? That's not how it is. And in fact, there's a new sheriff in town. And I am the one that gets to decide whether or not you are part of my people. And today you are. I am satisfying that in you. Jesus didn't remark that they were hungry or that they were disorganized. He remarked they were shepherdless. And as assuming that role as a shepherd, he clearly states that the powers that be were not and would never be a shepherd in their life. I told you that I'm not really going to end these conversations with good or maybe even what you would consider to be necessary life application. Because I think that story alone and how it reframes our perception of Jesus is enough to make us want to follow him or at least investigate him and to know more. So let me offer you this. Our church has a study. You're going to find this in the chat, especially a link called First Conversations. It's a PDF on our website. And in fact, you can open that tool up and you can start that study right now today. Some of you have already done that study. Some of you will do it. In fact, I will actually lead this study later on this spring in a Zoom format. But you can start today if you are curious about Jesus, if you're a skeptic or even a believer, but you need some more information. And who is this guy? And what is he doing? And why is he doing this? And what are the claims he's making on my life? I want to point you to that. That will help satisfy some of those questions, at least today. But I think this story alone is sufficient enough for you and I to think, if the Lord is my shepherd and I lack nothing, I do not lack, then it is he who's going to make me to lie down in green pastures. And it is he who's going to lead me beside quiet waters. He will satisfy not every need, but the greatest need. And that as someone who satisfies the wrath of God for my sin. The green grass and the quiet waters, those aren't promises that everything that we will ever want and need will be satisfied, but they are promises that the Good Shepherd stands in our place and rescues us from our own sin. That is the green grass, and that is the quiet waters. No one else can do that, as we see in Mark 6. The religious leaders of their day could not make that guarantee, but in Jesus, the greatest need and the greatest desire of our lives is absolutely satisfied. Hey, if you've not ever memorized Psalm 23, I hope you give it a shot. You'll find that it will bless your life in the most surprising ways. Trust me on this. So glad that you joined me today for the conversation. I am so loving this teaching series. We're going to be in verse 3 next week of Psalm 23. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you here again, right here next week. Blessings to you.